I don't know how you came into the whole issue of political involvement, activism, cultural issues, whatever it may be. But as Ricardo mentioned, what he didn't mention is I got kind of pushed into this thing, to be very honest with you. I had previously been distantly involved in what's happening culturally and what's happening politically. I'd supported some candidates and I had done some of that type of thing. But in 2003, when the ACLU sued Barrow County over the Ten Commandments in the courthouse, I was pastoring a fairly large church in Barrow County in that time, and we had a number of people who were involved in both county and city government. And when that lawsuit came, literally, we had a host of people in our church who were being sued by the ACLU, and here I was as the pastor, and it was just the right thing for me to, number one, stand in behalf of so many in our congregation who are being directly influenced by the ACLU, and secondly, to stand for the Ten Commandments. And so it was one of those kinds of things that literally I got pushed into the whole thing somewhat naively. It was at the same time Chief Justice Roy Moore was going through his deal in Alabama, so I was able to meet him. He got involved in our case. Zell Miller got involved. Alan Keyes got involved. Tony Perkins. A whole host of others got involved in what happened in Barrow County, began to take on some national influence, and I became the face of it, out of which the radio program grew and different things like that. And another major battle with me occurred a couple of years ago in 2008 when the Alliance Defense Fund had 33 pastors who were involved in what they called the Pulpit Initiative, an attempt to challenge the IRS code that says pastors cannot deal with certain things from the pulpit without potentially losing your tax exemption. And I was honored to be a part of one of those. And it was, again, it was one of those things that I deliberately, purposefully, knowingly violated the IRS code from the pulpit by endorsing a candidate and urging our people not to vote for Barack Obama. Our church was packed with media presence that day, and it was just like a click, all kinds of cameras and videos and all that sort of stuff upon doing that. But the very next day, I sent a copy of my sermon to the IRS with a letter and said, this is what I did. I don't believe I've broken a law, haven't violated the Constitution. In fact, I believe your code is unconstitutional, and I challenge you to come after me. I did that along with the other 32 pastors that were involved in that. And, of course, the IRS did nothing because they know that their code is unconstitutional. We do have liberties, and we don't violate, nor do we waive, I should say, our First Amendment right just because we're a pastor or in a church. So those things have shaped my life over the last few years. And you know, these last 7 or 8, 9 years have been a ride that I never anticipated in my life. It's been among the most exciting and at the same time the most discouraging points in my life. Seeing really that we are the problem, what's happening in America. Christian leaders, churches, pastors, we are the problem. We are sitting back watching our country literally go to hell while we have sat back. And Steve, what you were sharing just was so, man, we've been focusing on all the wrong things, ringing little bells while the issues have been driven by those that are directly opposed to Christian worldviews. And we've been having our rallies, and I've been a part of many of those rallies and have spoken at many of those things. But we've been having our rallies and we've been tooting our little horns while the opposing side have been driving agendas, and now we find ourselves behind the 8 ball. Now, Ricardo asked me specifically if I would address the eternal Word of God. And, you know, there is no question, and I know that you know this, all right? So several things I'm going to share with you in the next few moments are not things that you have not been aware of, that you're not aware of, to some extent preaching to the choir, so to speak. I realize that, but we've got to refocus. Our nation was established on Judeo-Christian principles, and until we get back to those principles, all the other issues ultimately that we're battling are not going to go anywhere. And I want to illustrate that to you. Now, you'll recall, well, you may or may not recall this, But in May of 1776 is when the Second Continental Congress, they were just battling. How are we going to deal with the issues that we're facing, specifically with Britain? And Richard Henry Lee stood up. He put forth a resolution that we declare independence from King George III, from Britain's taxation, intimidation, all that sort of stuff. The resolution passed, and then they brought forth and enlisted Thomas Jefferson to actually write a Declaration of Independence, which he started doing. There was much debate, many revisions, deliberations, but as you well know, they finally passed that declaration, and 56 signers got on board with it, and the birth of our nation was established. Now, here's what you also know, but you may not have thought of it like this, that whole process involved a radical, at that time in the world history, a radical idea of a nation being established under the principles of God, under the principles of all men being created equal, under the idea that we are all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. You've got to understand, that whole concept was radical thinking at that period of time in history. That everyone's created equal. That was a foreign concept. That there is a such thing as inalienable rights. A totally foreign concept, really, up until that point, particularly as it's related to establishment of national policy and understanding. And so they passed the declaration. It's signed. And now all of a sudden there are questions that begin to emerge. Questions like, how are we going to pull this thing off? How are we going to maintain this radical concept that we're all created equal and there are God-given rights that man cannot intrude with? How are we going to incorporate, and what are going to be the principles upon which our laws and our government is going to be established? And that's why it took so many years from that point of the Declaration to years later finally getting a constitution, wrestling through all these questions. How are we going to pull this thing off? Now, in that whole process, what was a God thing was that in the midst of all of that, really the answers to those questions were already being put forth largely by the colonies that had already laid the groundwork through their own charters, through their various colonies. And the bottom line was that the foundation was going to be the Word of God. And in all of the charters of the 13 colonies, that groundwork was firmly established. And so much so that you come to someone like Andrew Jackson, 7th President of the United States, he said, "This book, sir, is the rock upon which our republic rests. This is what it was established on." And that has been the foundation, as you well know, throughout our nation's history. Now, many of you were, and you know, it goes all the way through. I mean, there are literally tens of thousands of quotes and examples and all this kind of stuff that we could deal with in all of this. And I don't need to convince you that our Bible was the bedrock. The Word of God was the foundational element that this nation was established on. Nor do I need to convince you that it is now under attack, as well as the entire Christian worldview upon which our nation is established. But this whole thing has been clearly evident throughout the 230-something years of our nation's history, particularly. All right, 1950, just for instance. 1950, probably most of you were alive in here in 1950. Not everyone, but most everybody, it looks like. I'll just put it that way. Many of you were alive in 1950. You realize in 1950, Florida, the state of Florida Supreme Court of that state made the following statement in a ruling that they put forth. 1950, our lifetime, many of us in here. The Florida State Supreme Court said, "A people unschooled, about the sovereignty of God, the Ten Commandments, and the ethics of Jesus could never have evolved the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, or the Constitution. They said there is not one solitary fundamental principle of our democratic policy that did not stem directly from the basic moral concepts embodied in the Ten Commandments. You know, that's our lifetime, okay? That's right here where, can you imagine any court in America making a decision that even remotely goes in that kind of direction these days? That there is not one solitary fundamental principle of our democratic policy that did not stem directly from the basic moral concepts embodied in the Ten Commandments. You know, we had those kind of rulings all throughout our nation's history. We had those kind of rulings in our lifetime. But now we can't have prayer in public. We can't take Bibles to schools. We can't have a cross in the middle of a desert without it now being boarded up and covered in wood planks. Good Lord, what is happening to our culture? What is happening to our nation? And I come back to the fact that we are the problem. You go all the way back to our founder. You go back to John Adams. Now, we always hear about John Adams' quote that our Constitution was written for a moral and religious people and that it is totally inadequate for the government of any other. Do you know what he said before he made that statement? Leading into that statement, John Adams said that we do not have a government that is armed with the power to contend with human passions apart from morality and religion. Catch this. He said, we do not have a government that is armed with the capacity to deal with people who have no morality. He said, avarice, ambition, vengeance, gallantry, all these things would break the cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. And then he said, our Constitution was written for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. He says, catch this, y'all. This is what we've got to understand. And where Steve was talking about the Christian worldview, I pound on this every day. This is it. Our system of government does not work apart from the foundation and the boundaries and the guidelines of a Christian worldview. That is the basis upon which this whole thing was established. And now we're scared to death to even mention it. We've had judicial rulings in our lifetime proclaiming this is it. This is what we're based upon. And yet now we're scared to death to even mention a Bible verse. We're scared. We can't even have Bible verses mentioned in a jury before they make a decision. We have criminals walking the streets today because a juror had a Bible in the while he was sitting there talking about the case. We have become so afraid of our founding, our underpinning, that upon which we stand. And again, I know, I'm preaching to the choir, I know that you already know this. But this is who we are as a nation. And this is how far we have drifted as a nation. The fact of the matter is that you cannot have liberty apart from a Judeo-Christian worldview. It does not work. And I want to illustrate this. I was in a meeting when I was running for Congress with Mike Huckabee, and this conversation came up, and I don't make any claims of this illustration being mine because it's not, but it was an eye-opening. It was just an insightful illustration for me personally to be able to articulate that which I've been trying for years to articulate. And he said this. He said, this whole thing of a Christian worldview, morality, Christianity being our underpinning, and the fact that our government doesn't work. What did John Adams mean, y'all? In other words, what did he mean when he said that our Constitution was written for a moral and religious people? It won't work for any other group of people. What did he mean by that? All right, here's how Huckabee put it. He said, let's say we have two towns. One town that is a secular town, which we have become as a nation, and another town, which we'll get to here in a few moments, that has a Judeo-Christian worldview. Let's start over here with Town A. Town A, a town that has a secular worldview. What do you get in secularism in a community, in a country, however big or small you want to make this thing, that basically throws God out, that God is not a part of the equation? We're not going to have prayers. You can't take your Bible to school. You can't, all this. What do you get in that environment? Y'all just think through that yourself. Well, you get all kinds of problems. You get higher divorce rates. You get greater crime issues. You have problems with STDs. You got folks on drugs. You got kids not graduating from high school. You got divorce, so you got kids, latchkey kids. You've got folks that don't, you've got crime. You have to lock your doors at night when you go to bed. You have to lock your cars when they're in a church parking lot. All right, you get the picture? Now, let me ask you this. What is the response of government to that town? Well, government's got to be pretty heavily involved. There's so many problems. We need programs we need more judges to take care of all these divorce rates. We got, DFAC's got to get in here and do something with these kids. We got problems with STDs. We got to get in here and do something. We got unemployment. We got to get involved in here, and we got to stimulus this thing. You know, we got to get this thing fixed. And so government's response by necessity takes on a great influence. Now let's come over to Town B. A town with a Judeo-Christian worldview. Not that everybody in this town is a Christian. Let's just take the bare minimum. Let's just say that in this town, at least, everybody shares the golden rule where we're all going to treat each other like we want to be treated. Let's just take that as a very minimal standard, that is highly accepted in this town. Okay? This is the town that many of you grew up in. What do you get in this town? A town with a Judeo-Christian worldview. You have stronger marriages. Divorce is really the abnormal rather than the norm. You have kids growing up in families with moms and dads. We understand what marriage is. We understand what family is. Kids are growing up in that environment. They have a better self-esteem as a whole. More of them graduate from college, high school and college. More of them get good jobs. We don't have the problems with STDs. We don't have nearly the problem with crime. We got pretty good businesses want to locate here because you get honest days' work out of honest workers. I mean, we could go on and on and on and on. You get the picture. Now, what is the response of government to this town? Frankly, government's not greatly needed. And the reason that it is not greatly needed is because these people have the capacity to self-govern their own lives. And where there is the ability to self-govern within the confines of right and wrong, within the framework of a Judeo-Christian worldview, is the capacity for people to self-govern their own lives, and only in that environment can we have limited government. But the more we throw God out of the equation, the more impossible it becomes for limited government. In these days, we're all walking around, we're talking about limited government, and we want all this limited government stuff, but we're still throwing God out of the equation, and it is impossible. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is inadequate for the government of any other. Do you follow this? And this, it concerns me greatly And right now, in fact, this next week I have 2 radio shows on this one topic right here, and that is the movement towards a libertarian view. Y'all, I'm telling you, and I watch in churches and places where I speak, we got Christians by the truckloads now running over to jump on the bandwagon of libertarianism. And you've got to understand that libertarianism has at its base a foundation in atheism. It really comes out of the French Revolution. You had 2 revolutions taking place: the American Revolution, the French Revolution. The American Revolution is one that was radical. It acknowledged God. It acknowledged that all of us are created equal, that we are endowed by our Creator certain untouchable rights. Is the American Revolution. And one guy, very interesting, one guy that was right in the middle of all that is a guy named Thomas Paine. He was leading the charge. You probably remember Thomas Paine was leading the charge. He was one of the guys that was a major initiator in the early days of the American Revolution. Then he went to France, visited France, got a hold of what was happening in France with the French Revolution, where they were trying to put forth freedom without the inalienable rights, without God, just liberty, that man has the capacity to govern himself apart from God. That's the French Revolution. It was atheistic. And so Thomas Paine, after visiting France, he came back to America. In fact, he wrote a book. And he submitted it. Catch this. He submitted his book to his friend, Benjamin Franklin, who we all know is among the most ungodly, is what we're told, of our founders. Thomas Paine sent his book to Franklin, said, read this before I publish it and get it out in public. Franklin wrote him back and said, the best thing you can do with this book is burn it. Because he was espousing liberty without God. He was saying we need to get God out of all this talk that we're doing and trying to establish our nation. It doesn't belong. And he started espousing the principles of the French Revolution. And even the most secular among us, Ben Franklin said, the best thing you can do with this thing is trash it, burn it, throw it away. Do you know Thomas Paine ended up, y'all, do you realize it? He was so rejected by our founders, so rejected by our entire culture at that time. Thomas Paine died a pauper. He was buried in a field because a church would not allow his body to be buried in a church ceremony or in a church cemetery. Majorly rejected. Our founders, and y'all, that's the roots of libertarianism. It is liberty, liberty, liberty with no boundaries, which is chaos, anarchy. Our Constitution was written for a moral and religious people under the guidelines of right and wrong. And apart from that, you cannot have liberty without absolute chaos and anarchy and destruction. And so when you start looking, y'all listen, I listen to some of the libertarian stuff, and probably 70% of it, I'm like, yeah, that sounds good. But the other 30% of it totally is foreign to our American way of life. It is dangerous. It will lead us to absolute collapse because our system is based upon the Judeo-Christian principles of right and wrong, and God is the ultimate authority of good and evil, right and wrong, the giver of life, the giver of law. And you remove that, and everything that we have falls apart. Herbert Hoover, some of you probably have studied some of him. I came across this quote from him the other day. He said, the entire inspiration of our civilization springs forth from the teachings of Jesus Christ and the prophets. He said that to read the Bible is absolutely a necessity for the American way of life, because therein are the principles of our whole civilization. We've understood this up until the last 40 or 50 years. And while we, the church, has sat back and allowed shiftings to take place and to allow attacks to take place against our foundation, has now led us to where we are. One of the most And I don't know, how much time have I got left, Ricardo? I've kind of lost track. I apologize. I got 5 minutes. All right. One of the great evidences of where we have been, this was so clearly taught. What we're talking about here in our legal system, our political system, our educational system. Our entire culture understood the role of God in the Bible. And you go back even look at the founding institutions of our of greater learning and education, from Harvard University to Yale to Columbia to Princeton. All of these, and I've got some of these written down here. I'm not going to get into them right now. But all of them in their charters talk specifically. And you can still go to these universities. William and Mary, I was there not too terribly long ago and looked some of this stuff up right there. All of them were established for the propagation of the gospel, for the advancement of the kingdom of God, and all these kinds of things. And it's in their charters. It's still written on their walls of what they're established for. You remember the New England Primer. The number one, in fact, the first textbook in America, the number 2 selling book in America next to the Bible. And that primer, it started. This is the way we educated our children. A, Adam sinned. B is the Bible. You want to go to heaven? Then mind the Bible. You go straight down. C stood for Christ crucified, for us sinners. Our children were taught all the way down these principles because we understood these principles are what make the whole thing tick. And you throw away the clock and you can no longer keep time. And that's what's happened with us in America. So, and of course, when you talk about education, how can we get away from John Dewey? Here's where we get another atheist. John Dewey, he made the comment, he said, there is no God, there is no soul, hence there is no reason to lean upon the prop of traditional religion. And so here we go. The architect of modern education, John Dewey, and we start going down this path, forsaking the very principles and training and teaching. Noah Webster, by the way, Noah Webster was the original American father of education. And it was Noah Webster who said that the Christian religion is the most important and that all children, it is the first thing that all children in a free government ought to be instructed in. So that's why we had the New England Primer. That's why we had all these things. This was it. This was what our nation was based upon. And our nation doesn't work without it. Or are we watching that? We look these days, the attacks on religious liberties, the attacks on our Bible, the attacks on our capacity to get out and verbalize that which we believe. We look at what's happening this week, in the last couple of weeks, on the attacks on the Catholic Church and the Catholic hospitals. My question right off the bat are, where are the Baptists and where are the Methodists and where are the Presbyterians, where are the Lutherans, where's everybody else that has hospitals? But we're sitting back, yet again, watching as the Catholics are taking the punches. And here yesterday, Obama comes out saying, we're going to compromise this thing. So you realize it was no compromise whatsoever. We have had nothing, and we're this close from being duped again into believing that the president has conceded and compromised, and all these religious institutions are not going to have to fund abortion and all these practices. And there was no such thing in his so-called compromise. What he did was saying, all right, we're not going to make the hospitals pay for it. We're going to make the insurance companies pay for it, but we're going to make the hospitals buy the insurance. And so it's still the hospitals paying for all these services. But it gives the hospitals the right to say, we're not paying for it, they're paying for it. But in reality, we're the ones paying them to pay for the abortions. There's no compromise whatsoever in this, y'all. Don't be duped again. So many cases. I don't need to go over this with you. I deal with this kind of stuff every day on the radio with what's happening in our culture, the decline of our Christian morality and our Christian founding. It is destroying us. What we are facing is not a battle between Republicans and Democrats or anybody else, or conservatives versus liberals, or right versus left. What we are facing in this battle is a battle over worldview. And who are we going to be as a nation? And what we've got to do is understand from whence we have come and what has made us great, and do everything we can to. And I just, again, Steve, appreciate your very first point. We've got to get back to the Bible. You know, I'm telling you, that is, and we've got to hold our heads high in this. This is what's made us a great nation, is the principles of truth. I mean, just think about it. We profess this as truth. We know this is truth. Do we really think, therefore, that to depart from this, we can long survive? Can we long survive if we try to develop and operate our nation on anything other than truth? Then why are we ashamed or timid about getting back to this? And sure, there's a graceful way to do so. I understand that, and we need to, as graciously as possible, stand for truth. Stand for truth. So much more that we could deal with. Ricardo is giving me the exit sign. Let me just encourage you. I've written about a lot of this in It's Now or Never, a call to reclaim America. And I would encourage you to grab hold of that. And I look at Rick Warren this past week coming out saying I'd go to jail before I follow this president. I look at Richard Land, as many errors and things that he has done. He came out this past week saying we're on the verge of watching Christians go to jail with what's happening in our country right now. Y'all, it is now or never. We must get informed, get involved, and together. It doesn't take the mass numbers. It does take a squeaky wheel, though. And we need to learn to become the squeaky wheel driving a biblical agenda. Thank you so much.